This is Seventh Sanctum, and I am Kerry Ann.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for joining me. So my understanding of the story of Ursula and the haunting of the cage links back to a lot of ghost stories that are really significant to the St Osyth area and Clacton. So could I ask a little bit of how you become familiar with the story of Ursula and what that meant for you?
Yeah, sure. Basically, my interest is in the Essex witch trials generally. And I'm sure you and your listeners will know that we have the dubious distinction of having executed more alleged witches than any other county in England. I started off, as most people do, by looking at the infamous villain of about 80 years later, and I won't mention his name on this podcast.
Thank you.
But as a result of looking at the details of that, I realised that there had been a trial. Obviously, we're talking about Ursula and her co-defendants some 80 years previously. And this, if anything, I found more interesting because it's really the first time in English witch hunting history where we have multiple defendants in the same trial. Previous to this, you have one, maybe two prosecutions a year in Essex, and on this one we have 13. Some reports say 14, but I can only prove 13, so we'll stick to what I can prove on this. So we've got 13 defendants in the same trial. This was unheard of, and so I became particularly interested in it. I should have said my other interest is in placing memorials at significant sites around Essex where these atrocities took place. So this again is one where it stimulated some activity, and following work I did on the Ursula Kemp trial, we did manage to place a memorial outside Colchester Castle, where in fact they were all held prior to their trial. So that's the basic background of how I come into it. I'm a history nut. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to the Essex witch trials, and this one interested me more because of the unusualness of the fact that there were so many accused in the same trial.
I have a similar interest in the witch trials throughout England. It is a hotspot within Essex. One of the things that I found is that sometimes when you talk about the witch trials, we actually we dehumanize the victims and the women and the men and the children that went through what they went through. So, and we just focus on the bare facts. So we take away from the fact these people were mums and nans and they were, human beings. So that's something I found very difficult when doing research and looking at cases up and down the country. Is that something you found difficult?
You've hit it exactly. This is the biggest problem because the official records say so little, and when you talk to people who have these weird perceptions of what a witch was or is, for that matter, you get this just some sort of detached, oh yes, she was convicted of witchcraft. Well, what does that mean? Quite apart from, as you say, all the humanitarian concerns. And when you look at the trial records, the official records tell you what that individual was charged with, what the result of the case was. If you can understand a little bit of Latin, it tells you they might have had property or they might not. And it tells you the sentence. It doesn't give you any of the alleged evidence against them. The evidence wasn't kept normally. And so you've got no background whatsoever. And because of the nature of who these people were, you wouldn't know anything about them until they came to notice for being charged for something. And as you say, the wonderfulness, if it can be described as wonderful, when you go into these and you find some local evidence that gives you some background into those individuals and their families, how they lived, the effect, what we still don't know, we never will know, the effect on the families after the trials, even if they were found innocent, which a lot of them were, they've somehow got to get back into that community, many of whom will have given evidence against them. How on earth did they get back in to the community? And as you say, the children that were involved, you very much usually as witnesses and forced to give evidence, they've somehow got to be assimilated into society, and we'll never know how difficult that was for them. So yeah, the biggest plus for me is if I can get evidence, things that were written at the time. I am very skeptical when it comes to reading other people's accounts written sort of 50 years, 60 years later. So as far as possible, I try and get detailed information that was written at the time. Even then, we have to be a bit careful because very often they were written by the people who brought these people to trial in the first place. But reading between the lines, you can quite often get a good understanding of at least how people thought, how they reacted, and you can draw inferences from that.
And when you're talking about the time that the witch trials take place, we're talking about locations and areas that are very, like, they're villages, and their community was centered around the church. And that was their everything. So to be exiled from that and to be able to re-enter that community, this isn't a small thing. This is a disconnect from everything they've known and loved. Everything they are a part of is taken away from them. They go for this accusation, and it would have been quite difficult for them to then go back into their community and their society.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the other thing we find hard to understand is just how important the church was in those times, and to be cast out, sometimes literally, from the church was a huge thing. The very idea that you might even be buried outside of the protection of a churchyard was a source of horror for a lot of people, something which perhaps we find a little difficult to understand today. But it was a very real fear that you wouldn't go to this so-called place called heaven if you weren't buried in a particular physical spot, and the right words weren't said over your grave. That, you know, and whilst that might seem a little strange today, it was a very, very real fear. And yet, bringing this into context with St. Osyth, at the time we're talking about a community of no more than about 300 people. So that is very significant that if you're cast out of that community, which at that time you depended very much on each other's support when times were hard, as they frequently were, and we could make a big thing out of that, but that was the normality. But then it was absolutely the thing that if you were short of bread or cheese, your neighbour would support you. If they didn't support you, then that was evidence that could be used against you in your trial. If you were denied credit, that was evidence against you. And that is unbelievable in this day and age, but that was the way it worked. It could be said, no, she was denied credit, therefore there was something very wrong with her. And that, it's something that's really hard to get our heads around today.
One of the most absurd stories that I come across, I was looking into the Ipswich witches, and at a time in Ipswich they had a little commune for those that their husband had passed away, so they weren't able to enter the church by themselves. So they gave them a little commune, they gave them a little spinning wheel, and they would be confined to this area to keep them out of trouble and mischief, you can imagine. And if one was to be found to hold a Bible study, then they will be accused of having a coven. So if you can imagine not even being able to attend your church and being able to, because your husband's no longer there, and you're not able to do this thing. If you are, then you're accused of spreading, the word of the devil.
Yeah. I mean, the first, I don't want to trivialize it, but I mean, the idea that you can keep a group of women quiet by giving them a spinning wheel, I don't think that would cut much ice today, let alone then. No, you're right. In fact, it goes further until the 1950s. which I can remember. Of course, you certainly won't, and I'm sure none of your listeners will either. But the 1950s, women were not allowed back into church after giving birth until they'd been through a ritual, and it was called the churching of women. So old ideas and horrific sort of stigmatization was still rife in the church in the 20th century.
Yeah, there is some things that I've come across, and I think that was within my lifetime.
Yeah.
And it's just or within a lifetime that these things were still, taking place. When you think of the last person that was trialed as a witch as well, and it wasn't, I know it was a long time, but it really wasn't in the concept of time and
No.
distance from where we are. In it with the Witchcraft Act, that within it, that wasn't.
The 1957 was the final abolition of that, and then you get the Fraudulent Mediums Act and things that follow on from that. But so it seems that even then you see that you get this sort of reluctance to sort of genuinely just throw it all away. We've got to keep some sort of control over these people, you know.
Yes. So could you tell me a little bit about the story of Ursula, please?
Okay. As I said before, with all these people, it's difficult to get much of a handle on what they did before they came to notice, because basically they were just surviving in their community. We know that she had either been married or had a relationship before these events, because she was also known by the name of Ursula Gray. And we also know at the time of her arrest, she had a son aged about 7 or 8 years, and he was called Thomas Rabbit. So that suggests that she'd had at least 2 relationships. We don't know anything about Mr. Gray. We don't know anything about Mr. Rabbit, because at this time she was single. She was living in St. Osyth, as you say, and amongst a community of about 300 people. There is some suggestion that she's had some basic knowledge of herbs, and it's very basic, really very basic. The story is, and it's in the evidence written down, most of it written down by the magistrate, Brian Darcy, that Ursula apparently went to see a woman in Wheely when Ursula was lame, and the woman in Wheely gave her a cock and bull story about how to cure herself using hog's dung, chervil, and pricking the ball of stuff with a knife 3 times. Hope you're all making notes about this and going to try it out when you're next lame, and then throwing the ball of dung into the fire. And perhaps more interesting, then dosing herself night and morning with some hot ale, into which was some herb john, presumably St. John's wort, which wouldn't be appropriate anyway, but maybe the warm ale might have helped. However, having been given this wonderful remedy by the widow Cox from Wheely, Ursula then that became her mantra, and in the evidence that's what she recommended to other people when they came to her lately for a cure for lameness, and she would repeat this that she'd been told by Mother Cox. So that gives you some idea of her knowledge, which isn't wonderful. She may have known a bit more. But the bottom line is, it reflects what we were talking about earlier, that in times of trouble, everybody would rally round and help. She did make a bit of money by attending births. I hesitate to call her a midwife, because again, all the women used to rally round. I mean, childbirth, as we know, is dangerous enough these days, but in those days, and I don't think we mentioned the date, we ought to mention the date, it's obviously 1582. In those days, child mortality was extremely high. We're talking about 40-50% of deaths at birth. Not unusual at all. So at a time of that sort of crisis, all the women, and of course it would be only women at that time, would rally round and do all they could. Sometimes might do a bit of harm, but they meant well. And things that today would not result in death, of course, very often did then. If they were faced with a breech birth, for example, then that could very often mean the end. A C-section, of course, was out of the question. So, which explains why there were so many infant mortalities. So Ursula certainly did go and help out at these situations. I suspect that when she did get a reputation for being able to help people, I don't think she worried at all if people thought that her skill in some part was due to some special powers. It probably gave her a bit of kudos in the community. We'll never know. That's just my feeling about it, because as I say, there's no evidence to show that she had a widespread knowledge generally. But she did help out. She made a bit of a living wet nursing babies, children, while their mothers went to work, mainly in the fields or at the priory nearby, which suggests that she was still of childbearing age. That's the other, that really annoys me, really frustrating, because in a lot of the court records, they don't mention the defendants' ages, and there's no mention anywhere of Ursula's age. But I would put her probably no more than, bearing in mind that Thomas, her son, was 8, I would put her no more than about 32, 33, and that's probably older than she was, because I mean you could get married easily at 13 or 14 years of age in these times, and if you did lose a husband, you found another one as quickly as possible, because living on your own in those times was a real problem, male or female. Mainly for the females, it was a really big problem if you're on your own. So there was a good, strong community of women who had either been widowed or for some other reason been left on their own. And these became friends. And amongst Ursula's friends, we have her special friend, Elizabeth Bennet. We have Alice Newman. And at the end of the trial, we end up with a number of other people being implicated, because although I'm jumping ahead a bit, it follows the pattern of later trials, where once one is arrested and is forced to confess to certain things. In this case, oh, what was that? Something squeaked. In this case, spooky.
I think someone just stood on a dog's toy. That's what it was.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Where was I? Yeah. So in this case, once partial admissions or confessions start coming out, they're told, and Brian Darcy's quite smug about this. He actually admits that he's promised Ursula that she'll be dealt with more leniently if she confesses. Obviously, if that was done today, the whole case would be thrown out, but he thinks this is a good way to move forward. So as a result, Ursula does, and she mentions Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth Bennet mentions Joan Peachy, and the whole thing snowballs, and eventually we get 13 people, which is probably horrifying for Brian Darcy, because he thought he was going to have a nice little 2 or 3 people trial, which would give him a bit of kudos in the community, because he was trying to impress his cousin, who'd recently become Lord of the manor. He'd become Lord Darcy, so same surname, but he Lord Darcy lived at the Priory and was a lot younger than Brian Darcy. So that was probably the motivation for Brian Darcy to get involved with it at all, because up to that time, you were quite happy if you had somebody who was able to do some basic medicine in your community. You'd welcome them. They were never called witches, never, until something went wrong. Then all of a sudden, overnight, oh yeah, she's a witch. Look what she's done. So I ramble. I'm sorry. I go. I get carried away.
No, absolutely not. It's really fascinating, because it's a good way of understanding what was happening within that community, and all the different things that were added to the melting pot that created this situation where this took place, and how the knock-on effect that had for all the other people that were linked to her as well. And I can imagine, you can see how it all took place, but at the same time, it is also unbelievable that it's happened. Is there
Yeah.
anything in particular that you think at that time as well, outside of that? I know we spoke about what it was like in the community for them within their village. Is there anything else that you think was happening around about that time that could have compounded that? I know in previous things that we've looked at, there's been it could be that we had the Cold War in one. We had another situation where there was low food. All these kind of things felt like there was a punishment from the gods, and then that's why this kind of that set the fire alight, so to speak.
Well, there were several things actually. We had 2 successive bad winters. This all kicks off, of course, in February, March of the year. So you're just coming out of the winter, and this is when things are at their worst for people with very little resources or money. So that almost certainly is a factor. The fact that Ursula was prepared to accept cheese instead of payment in cash for some of the services she offered, which wasn't unusual anyway for people to give products rather than money. There was also an unusual situation. About 3 years before this, Queen Elizabeth herself had visited St. Osyth and had stayed, and almost certainly Brian Darcy would have been with her, that because he was one of the dignitaries of the village at the time. She stayed at the priory with the then Lord Darcy, who had since died, and as I say, the younger Darcy had taken over. Now, bearing in mind that these prosecutions were brought under Queen Elizabeth's Witchcraft Act, which had come into force, this would be about 15, 16 years before her visit. It's possible there was a conversation or a discussion. I'm speculating here, we don't know. But the fact that Queen Elizabeth had visited 3 years before may have been a factor in Brian Darcy suddenly taking an interest in alleged witchcraft. Again, we'll never know. There had been 18 deaths over that winter. Bear in mind, we're talking about a population of 300. That's all. We've got 18 deaths, 10 of which have been children. So, as you say, when people say, oh, yes, it's a sign from God or we're being penalised, who should we blame? Which, of course, doesn't change the same today. Who should we blame? So there were certainly factors you can point to and say yes, almost certainly these had a bearing on what took place.
So from my understanding of Ursula Kemp is linked to the cage. And the conversations that what actually linked us together actually was because I was visiting the area and I just wanted to have a bit more information on the trials that are taking place and to go deeper than the faults around the cage and how highly it's been investigated by paranormal researchers alike. So that's kind of how our discussion started. So could you share again with me how that come about and where we are today with it?
Yeah, gladly. The cage, and if you go to many villages around the country, you will find they had a cage, and this was the local name for the village lockup. Of course, you didn't have a policeman at that time. You didn't have a constabulary. You didn't have a militia in a small village. You had a local constable, and that doesn't carry the same meaning as the word constable today. The constable then was an employee of the Lord of the Manor, and he was responsible for giving out charitable donations from the taxes and also collecting taxes. But he had the title of constable. He usually had property of his own, so he wasn't an ordinary man in the street. He usually had property of his own. I mention this because if you look at the sign, of course, on the side of the cage, it says Witch's Prison. And I get quite unpopular because I have to say, well, actually, it was never a prison, let alone a witch's prison, because a village of 300 people couldn't afford to have a prison with prison staff, and you wouldn't have need of one. What it was, the original building that was there, was the local lockup, where if you had a drunk or somebody who'd done something wrong, they were thrown in there for the night because you had no right to bail like you had now, and you would be taken before the magistrate, Brian Darcy in this case at our time, and you'd be dealt with the following morning. You wouldn't wake him up in the middle of the night, even, unless it was a murder or something. Anyway, so basically it was a small building. Some of them are still standing. The originals are still standing in Essex and Suffolk particularly. And you'll see they're a lot smaller than the existing building at the Cage now. It's the Cage at St Osyth is almost certainly where the original building was. I've got photographs of a single-story building that was there before the present kitchen was built. It's the kitchen area that we believe is the site of the original Cage. And then it would have housed 3 people at the most, but you'd have to be pretty friendly with each other if you had 3 people in there. And after they'd been dealt with by the magistrate, if it was a minor matter like drunkenness or a small punch up, you'd be dealt with the following morning and you'd be on your way. If it was a more serious offence, as in our case here that we're talking about, then once Darcy had finished questioning you, you would be charged by him, and then you would go to a proper prison, because you could not be kept in a cage after you'd been charged. You have to go to a proper prison, and that was Colchester Castle. And that's where Ursula and all her co-defendants, after they'd been questioned and charged, they were all transferred to Colchester Castle, where they stayed until their trial later. Which wasn't that much later, luckily for them, because if you stay in Colchester Castle cells for very long, you probably die before you get to trial, which happened, of course, 80 years later. So we have that. That's the situation with the Cage. Ursula, of the 13 defendants, was in the Cage the longest. She was in there for 5 nights. But of course, other people do paint a more romanticized and story about it, and there's no reason why she would be kept there until her trial. She couldn't be kept there. It would be illegal to do that. Even in those days, you had to go to a proper, and to be honest, I don't suppose they'd want to, because they'd have to feed her and clothe her and look after her at their own expense. So she went there. There's also no reason to suppose that any children were ever put there, because the children in this were witnesses. And of course, even the idea of putting witnesses in the same small area as the people they were testifying against doesn't bear scrutiny. So I have heard some people say, yes, that Thomas was put in there with his mother. Well, it doesn't make any sense at all. What happened to him is worth talking about, because he somehow has got to survive while his mother is being prosecuted, and there's nothing in writing anywhere to help us with what happened to him during the trial or after. So getting back to the Cage, yes, it's probably on the site of where the original smaller building was that was the Cage, but I'm sorry, it was never a prison, let alone a witch's prison.
Is there anything that you've heard over the years that you know is absolutely not, for example, it not being a witch's prison? Is there anything else that you've heard over the years that we could kind of debunk at the moment? It doesn't make sense or isn't logical? There's evidence against it.
I'm not an expert on the paranormal, so there's no way I'm going to say anything against that, because I don't have that gift, and I'm more than ready to accept that there are people who are either lucky enough or they might consider unlucky enough to be able to be sensitive to things in these areas that I'm not. There's no doubt that there has been a tragedy or two happen in that building, but that's in more recent years. There was a suicide there in I think the 1970s. It might have been 80s, but I haven't come prepared for that one. But certainly there was a suicide there. So I can quite understand that if there are feelings, if there is some resonance in there, but but then you see, there aren't many old buildings that haven't had a tragedy or two, somewhere in their time. That's the very nature of how we live. So I can't. There's no reason to suppose that that there haven't been some nasty incidents in there. Domestic violence is the most likely thing, to be honest, because it's all too prevalent, and even more so in time when times were hard, and people had less recourse to other remedies. So I can quite understand that there are disturbances and things there that some people are susceptible that I'm not. But the things that were done in the cage, when there was an excavation, I believe, in the kitchen area, well, I'm not quite sure what was expected to be found. I know some cattle bones were found there, which I don't think was very helpful to anyone. But I am probably not the right person to ask about that, other than that I am certainly not saying that there isn't some sort of feeling that can be felt in these places, but I'm not one of those people who's been aware of it.
No, I understand. What I was thinking more along the lines of like a false collective memory. So, for example, with the Sarah Moore case, Sarah is based in Leigh-on-Sea. She was known as the Sea Witch, and she was accused of the Great Flood of the Thames, and it happened about 7 years after she had died. But still to this day, people that live in Leigh-on-Sea, that have lived there all their lives, still very much believe that Sarah Moore was the causation of this great flood, even though there was 7 years before she had passed away. So I'm thinking about more in the community in terms of beliefs that are there, that there's evidence that actually says that we found that I say we, I wasn't part of the committee, but there was found Sarah Moore's death certificate, so we was able to show when she had passed away in comparison to the actual date of the flood. So things like that that might have come up, that people in the community or people within the paranormal community, whereas evidence has stated that something might not have happened or did happen.
Ooh,
sorry.
no, it's all right. I no, I'm just trying to think of specific, because it's an area that I don't actually normally get too concerned with when I do hear it. No, I'm struggling there, actually.
That's absolutely fine. In terms of paranormal research, I think it's really good for people that do investigate the paranormal to have a wider understanding of what actually has taken place. What are we investigating? Are we investigating the false collective memory that's been put there or has been manifested or created over the years that have no, other than a belief? There's no evidence that it's happened.
Yeah.
Whereas knowing that something didn't happen when they think they did, it can be quite confusing when researching. But I know that when you spoke previously about the plaque that you had put in Colchester, could you tell me a little bit what that means to you, what it means to the community, and kind of and how you was able to do that?
That actually was one of the proudest things that I've done. There has never been a proper memorial in Colchester to those who were accused of witchcraft. And I'm not just talking about those who were convicted and hanged for witchcraft. We touched on it very early on in our conversation that even if you were acquitted, and 75% roughly of all cases were acquitted, that has a huge impact on you and your family and getting back into the community. So the memorial is to all those who were held in Colchester Castle on charges of witchcraft, whether they were convicted or not, because they were all victims, and genuine victims. 10% were men, 90% were women. And we're looking at a total, and I had to be careful when I worked out the wording on it, because I didn't want to be accused of inflating figures. So I've said over 200. I since know it's over 300. And we're talking of a period of about 120 years, starting from the Witchcraft Act of 1563. So this did follow on from when I was able to rebury the remains that I recovered that for a long time had been believed to be Ursula Kemp. And I thought that because we decided not to put a headstone over the grave, because when the bones were originally covered, it didn't have a headstone, and it wouldn't have had a headstone in 1582. I thought, well, there ought to be a memorial, and so that's what triggered the move to have the memorial in Castle Park. Fundraising, I thought would be difficult. We got the money raised within 2 weeks.
Okay.
That was the depth of feeling for it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything went smoothly. The manager of the park, I mentioned his first name, Ian, he's now retired. He went round with me and we looked at several places where the plaque could be. And from start to finish, he went out of his way and he pointed out a perfect place in the middle of the rose bed, beautifully shaped. And he said, "How about there?" I said, "Great." And he even suggested the shape of it so it would fit in with the shape of the rose beds. Why was that so easy? Because by a fluke, he'd taken part in a film I'd made about the arch villain that we won't mention it, he who shall not be named, and he had played the part of a village constable for me in a previous film that I'd made. So talk about karma, it works both ways. You help somebody and they'll help you. So that was meant to be. Colchester Council, absolutely unanimous in their support across all parties. And it was an absolute joy to work on a project where nothing was put in my way. And so we had it was a small ceremony, not that many people there. It did get on the local BBC News, but it meant so much. And since then, I have managed to get another memorial at Chelmsford, not as close as I would like, but close to the site where the hangings took place. Manningtree have now brought their own small plaque up in the town square, which I had nothing to do with, although I did go to the unveiling. So I'm just delighted. I think the time is coming when people are finally realizing, yes, we have got to acknowledge this. People have been spoken about sort of history and things they don't like, but you can't ignore it. History is all of our history, not just the things we like. And if we ignore these people, if we ignore the victims and only talk about the villains, then we're doing the wrong thing.
I agree, and so much has changed. There's been lots of conversations with lots of different people in lots of different ways. So I know there's been massive changes that's happened in Scotland for the trials that's happened there. I know that there's a movement, Sisters of Spoon, I think they're called, for the Pendle witches.
Yes.
They're amazing stuff as well, of the women of Pendle. So I know that there's lots of conversations, but I still don't believe people understand the magnitude of death and the absolute reign of terror that flooded the country and beyond. And people don't actually, they detach themselves from the fact that these are people who are human, and it's really hard because in the conversations that I've had when I do podcasts and I talk about the different trials that have taken place, the different women that have been involved, where these women have come from, what they've done, the areas that they lived, all the way through. I know I'm telling facts, I'm talking about what happened and why. I have to keep reminding people, this is a person, by the way, this actually happened to a person. And when you think about what those people went through as well is horrific, and again, having these conversations and having these plaques put in place and having women's names being honored makes a difference. It echoes through the time, but it also makes a positive movement for the present as well and the future. It makes a big difference, these ripples, and changes is turning a little, although we still do have people that are a bit not as educated in what witchcraft or being a witch is, and they have those negative connotations that have kind of been dripped through social media and so forth. So yeah, it is really interesting. These conversations do definitely need to be having. So in terms of the work that you've done, could you tell us a little bit more about that? The films that you've made, sorry, and any literature, anything along those lines?
The first film I made is based on I'll have to mention his name. No, I won't. I'm looking at you. No, I won't. Okay. All right. Well, it's based on He Who Shall Not Be Named in this podcast. But unlike other films and documentaries, this is told from the victim's perspective. And this was made in conjunction with the local theatre company. We had a lottery grant to make it. It's not available at the moment, I'm afraid, because I'm looking to sell part of the copyright of it to somebody else. So, but there are clips of it on my YouTube channel, very short clips of it. I'm hoping to get rights to. Well, I own half the rights, so I'm hoping to put a bit more. But anyway, that was very well received and had a local theatre showing. But that's all about 12, 15 years ago. I made that now. And then the second one is the Ursula Kemp documentary that is on YouTube. It's not publicly available, but I'm very happy to send you the link. So if you and your listeners would like to look at the whole documentary, you're very welcome to. So that's that. And I'm presently writing a book about Ursula, and it is a fiction book, but it touches on what you're saying actually about the people and the community, and I'm filling in the gaps with how I think they were living and the family life and how they interacted with each other. So that's still in the writing. I'm not a natural writer, so it's taking me a lot longer than I thought it was going to take. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I am researching another Essex witch who I believe was the first to be executed under the Elizabethan Act. She is from Essex, so she comes from Great Waltham. Her name is Elizabeth Lowes. And she was tried initially in a church court, and she was so unlucky, unbelievably unlucky. If she'd been tried in the church court, even though it was a murder charge, she could not have been sentenced to death. The church court could not sentence you to death. However, while the trial was going on, Queen Elizabeth's law was passed, and she was transferred to the civil court for her trial to be heard there. So if they'd done the trial 6 months earlier, she would have lived. As it was, she was transferred to the civil court, was convicted. She pleaded pregnancy, so she delayed her execution. 6 months later, she was found that she wasn't pregnant, so she was hanged then. And about 2.5 months ago, I found the original trial documents in the church records. As I say, the civil court cases did not keep the witness statements. I've found the witness statements from the church records. So work is still ongoing, and it's those eureka moments. I just love it. I just love it.
I was going to say, I'm sure this has been an absolute journey through all the different research that you've done on the two different women and those beyond that. I'm sure it's been an absolute journey of massive highs. And books is not easy.
It's a lot of hard slog.
Yes.
But I also like you probably gather, I like talking about it, and quite often I go on too long. But when I give talks to a lot of witchy organisations, obviously, but WIs, it is more the women that are interested than the men. I wonder why that is. But I always talk from the victim's perspective, because they are the people, they are the ones who were involved. And as you said, and we both touched on it. What is a witch? What's a witch today? how do you define it? And a lot of what we do today, things that some people do that can't be explained, does that make us witches because we do things that cannot be explained? Are paranormal people witches because they're sensitive to things that other people aren't? How do you define that? So I just love all that.
And also, what I think is a really fascinating question for me is why are you afraid? What is there to be afraid of? What is concerning you? And a lot of the time, it's bringing that conversation back onto them. What are you afraid of? Is always an interesting question to ask. And a lot of it is through not really not going away and doing their own research or educating themselves outside of what is being given to them through the normal means.
Go on. Yeah, a lot of people still have the 17th century definition of a witch. That is what a witch is. And you know what? Disney has got a hell of a lot to answer for. That's the first. You think about it. Every child in this country, from an early age, has it reinforced year after year after year. This is what a nasty witch looks like. Witches are nasty. It's no small wonder, really, that it is such a difficult thing to overcome. It is drummed into every child in this country that's what witches are.
And I agree. And I had a really interesting conversation actually about Wizard of Oz and the Good Witch Glinda, when she stole her sister's shoes after the house fell on her. It's like, who is wicked?
Yeah.
Who is wicked after all?
Yeah, you just killed a witch and you pinched her shoes. Bloody hell.
Absolutely. Oh, well, thank you so much for chatting with me. I look forward so much to seeing your documentary. I would love to have more conversations. This topic of witches and witchcraft, especially the historical factors of it, is so broad. They're so interesting, and I'd love to have more of those conversations with you if ever you're happy to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and
you're very welcome.
Everyone that's listened to us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you, or I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.